Welcome back to 535. I'm Brody Mullins. Delighted to have Robin Cook with Coinbase. Thanks for joining us. So we got a first ever on 535. We're trying to follow the Senate Banking Committee markup, basically live on crypto. You were in the hearing. What's going on, or in the markup? What's going on?
Well, I mean, it's a busy day. That always happens right before a markup. But I think that a lot of conversations are happening in real time. And I think that there's a real possibility that we do end up with a strong bipartisan vote coming out of today. Regardless of that, a lot of work has been done going into this markup, and I think that this bill is ready for prime time. There has been a real concerted bipartisan effort that's occurred for both members and staff to really get in the weeds, and I think that they've done a lot of really good work, and it's ready to go to the floor.
So tell us about the bill and sort of its path to where we are now. It zipped through the House. It was on its way to what looked like a pretty easy markup in Senate banking in January, and then everything went crazy. What happened?
Yeah,
well,
so,
first tell us about the bill. What does the bill do?
So first of all, what does the bill do? It provides a regulatory framework at the federal level for crypto. That doesn't exist today. It brings new consumer protection, new regulation when none exists. So in that sense, it's transformative, I think, both for the industry and for consumers, and protects them regardless of where they live in a uniform way. What happened in January really actually can date back to what happened in October. There was a leak, which sometimes happens in Washington, of a draft document that wasn't intended to see the light of day, and that caused, I think, there to be a real closing of the ranks in terms of putting together important aspects of the bill. They thought they had it right. When they finally released it publicly, it turns out that they didn't as much, and so there needed to be some work done to solve for the technical problems that were in the language, and we just didn't have enough time as it was going to the markup. What also happened is that there's been this pretty public fight with the banking industry. There's been 4 months of pretty serious negotiations that have happened in the Senate and at the White House. Once those were resolved, and those other technical issues, so that the members could achieve what they were trying to do in January, we were here and able to get it ready to go.
And then after that point, there were negotiations between the crypto industry and the traditional banks. Did that yield a compromise?
So it did. What happened was the White House convened a series of meetings over the course of several months, as did several senators, and ultimately Senators Tillis and also Brooks arrived at a compromise that I think protects bank deposit structures in really important ways. What they said is that if it's a crypto asset, you shouldn't be able to have it be functionally equivalent to a bank deposit. That protects bank deposits and ultimately enables the bill to move forward.
And I mentioned the word yield unintentionally, but yield is the key issue here. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it actually relates to a bill that happened last year, which is stablecoins. That's basically a digital equivalent of a US dollar. The banks feel like that could be a deposit substitute, and so they want to make sure that there isn't interest that's able to be paid in the same way that you would be able to get on a traditional bank account. What the compromise says is that if it's functionally or economically equivalent to a bank deposit, you can't have any sort of yield paid for it, but that if it's connected to real bona fide activity in the crypto ecosystem, that you can. And that enables the crypto industry to still be able to grow and develop and be able to contact consumers in the way that is key.
And if this bill were to come out and be bipartisan, that would be a huge step forward, be a surprise to me at least. Do you think we'll get more than one Democrat, or how are things leaning?
You know, I can't speak for the members. I think it's going to be an interesting day. I think that there's a lot of conversations that are underway. I think that there are at least 5 Democrats on the banking committee who would like to get to yes on this. There are a couple of issues that are still being worked through, and so I think it's just really a question of whether those can be worked through before the end of the markup, and that'll dictate the numbers. I think the larger point, though, is that there are a lot of Democrats that are working on this bill. This bill is going to be bipartisan when it hits the Senate floor, and I think it's a product that both Republicans and Democrats can feel really good about voting for because it is protective of consumers.
And once this bill passes, assuming it does get through the committee today with however many Democratic votes, there are still some other sticking points that have sort of been pushed aside. One of them is the Democratic language for some sort of ethics reforms on the Trump family's investments in crypto. How does that get worded? Is that something that Democrats have to have in this bill, and how do you deal with that?
I think it is something that Democrats have to have in this bill, and a lot of work has been done behind the scenes to work on those issues. They're very close. Whether they get there before the end of the day today, I think is an open question, but I am quite confident that they'll get there before it goes to the floor.
There's another proposal that would potentially restrict federal officials from owning crypto. Is that another provision that could get in there? Will that be held for the Senate floor?
Yeah,
debate?
I mean, I think ultimately the language is probably going to get added on the floor just because it's a banking committee bill and ethics issues aren't dealt with in the banking committee. But I do think that real progress has been made on those questions and that it's going to get addressed.
I think something like 20% of Americans, 1 in 5, own some sort of crypto assets. How would their life change or their investments benefit if this legislation becomes law?
They would have a uniform consumer protection regime regardless of where they live. Today, if you live in New Jersey, you have a very different legal framework than if you live right across the river in New York. And that just doesn't make any sense for what is truly a global marketplace. You're going to have a uniform set of federal protections. You're also going to have a federal national regulatory structure which makes America competitive around the world. It's a global marketplace, and so 50 state regimes just doesn't make any sense.
Last question. I think there's more than 100 amendments pending. Is this going to be a late night for you?
You know, I don't know how many of them are actually going to get offered. You know, ultimately the Senate kind of works its magic in terms of you know, the process of making members feel like that they've raised the issues that they want to raise and want to get heard. But I definitely think it's going to be a long afternoon.
Robin Cook, Director of U.S. Policy for Coinbase, thanks so much for coming on. Come back next week and we'll talk about what's going on next. I'm Brody Mullins. Thanks for joining us on 535. We'll be right back.